morning, everyone. I'm Ann Cuppinger with the Community Technical Assistance Center, and I want to welcome you to today's webinar. We're going to give folks a couple minutes to sign on. We have a lot of folks registered today, so we'll be right back with you in just a minute. Hi, if you're just joining us, we're just giving folks a couple minutes to sign on, and we'll be right back with you. All right. I think we'll get started. It looks like there's still a few folks trickling in. Good morning, everyone. My name is Ann Cuppinger. I'm with the Community Technical Assistance Center. And today we're here for part 3 of a series that we're doing called Education Matters, a webinar series for family and youth peer advocates. Have no fear, if you're not a family or youth peer advocate, we are still really glad that you're here. This webinar today is going to focus on special education evaluations and assessments. And our presenters, Jen Sibley from the Northern Regional Center for Independent Living and Jed Schwartz from the Long Island Advocacy Center, are going to help us understand what all those numbers mean. And I'll introduce them a little bit more later, but if I can have the next slide, Jen. See, there we go. So I think everyone's pretty familiar with Zoom by now, but just so that you get a little bit of an orientation for today, we have over 100 folks signed up for this webinar and signed on today. So you've all been joined in listen only mode, but we really do want to hear your questions and hear your ideas. So if you open up the chat box on the bottom of your screen, that speech bubble will open up a chat box on the side, and you're able to chat in questions and see the responses that other people chat in too. So, be active in the chat. And we will sometimes be able to answer your questions along the way, but more likely we'll be gathering those questions up and collecting them and answering them during a Q&A session at the end. If you have any technical difficulties, you can chat to the CTAC host, and Phung Tran, who is on our team, will be able to help you out with any difficulties you might be having in that regard. Next slide, Jen. So as I mentioned, this is the last of 3 webinars in a 3-part series. And the other 2 webinars, and as well as this one, will be posted to the CTAC website. The first one is already up, and the other 2 will be up soon. When you go to our website, you can navigate to the upcoming events page where you'll find a calendar. And on these different dates, you'll see the posting of the recording of the previous webinar, along with slides and any handouts for that particular date. If you open up your chat, you'll find that you're going to see the slides for today. A PDF of the slides for today will be posted in your chat. So, one way or another, you should be able to get all of the materials that you need. And I do want to encourage folks, if you have a colleague or someone that you work with that would find this helpful, you can also forward those links to other people. We encourage that. Next slide, please. So this webinar series came together because we were getting a lot of feedback on other webinars that people were looking for some additional sort of 101 training on the basics of educational advocacy. So we formed a partnership. CTAC and Families Together worked together to engage a number of folks from across the state who have expertise in this area. And so this webinar series, it really comes to you with the benefit of expertise from Starbridge, the Long Island Advocacy Center, Vibrant Emotional Health, and the Northern Regional Center for Independent Living. So today we have two presenters. We have Jennifer Sibley, who is the Family Support Services Program Director and a credentialed family peer advocate at NERCL, and they're in Watertown, New York. Jen has been working with families of children with disabilities for 13 years. In her time as a family peer advocate, she has supported military families as the Fort Drum Family Peer Advocate and has worked under the U.S. Department of Education grant as a parent training and education coordinator to provide advocacy and parent and community training in the northern 10 counties of New York State. Her lived experience and her greatest joy comes from her two boys, Wyatt, who is 18 and has autism, and Tyler, who is 4 and is neurotypical, but a bundle of endless energy. And I will say that we have enjoyed their company as we've been planning this webinar. Jed Schwartz is the Assistant Director and Coordinator of Youth Advocacy for the Long Island Advocacy Center, or LIAC, and has been working with families and students with disabilities for 13 years. As an educational advocate, she mostly works with families of youth who are involved in the juvenile justice system to assist them in obtaining the appropriate services to be successful in school. She co-wrote a youth-centered training curriculum and facilitated groups for teenagers with emotional and/or behavioral difficulties, focusing on self-awareness, communication skills, and self-advocacy skills. We also have with us today two of our other team members who will be available to also help answer questions. Rosalia Watkins, who's the Educational Services Specialist at Vibrant Emotional Health, and Mindy Turansky, who is an Assistant Director for LIAC. And I just want to thank all of our presenters and welcome everyone to this webinar. You're going to see a poll pop up in just a second. We want to get a little bit of a sense of who you are. So if you can just check off the category that you most identify with. I know many of you wear multiple hats. So what hat are you wearing today? That will give us an idea of who's here on this webinar today. While you're answering that poll question, I do want to let you know that at the end of this webinar, you're going to see a link to a survey that CTAC will ask you just to complete, letting us know, how useful this webinar was to you and asking for your input on future training topics. And I just want you to know that this series was born of that feedback. So please take a second to answer that survey when it pops up at the end of the webinar. Great. I see folks chatting in. If these categories don't fit you, absolutely chat in who you are and what your role is. We have a CASA advocate. I used to be a CASA. Worked for the CASA State Association of CASA. It's great to see everyone. A child welfare person. Terrific. Thank you for coming. All right. So you can see we have a lot of family peer advocates. We have youth peer advocates and supervisors of family youth peer advocates. We have a couple of parents on, which is terrific. Welcome. We've got folks from schools, lots of mental health professionals. This is terrific. And care coordinators. And then, as I mentioned, a number of other people from different disciplines. You know, school touches kids no matter what system they come through the door into. So we're really glad that you're all here, and please let us know what your needs are as we move forward. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jen and Jen.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. And on behalf of the other Jen and myself, I want to say it's an honor to be here this morning to present to you about special education evaluations and assessments. And hopefully by the time that we're done talking to you this morning and into this afternoon, you're going to have at least a working understanding of what do all these numbers mean. So anytime we talk about evaluations and the evaluation process, that always starts off with how to begin that process. And the best way to do that is to talk about what kind of concerns that you have. So any evaluation starts by looking at what those areas of concerns are, whether they are physical concerns, cognitive concerns, social or behavioral concerns, speech and language concerns, or educational concerns. And there are different evaluations that you can request in each of those functional areas that will kind of narrow down that process. So the first step in making that referral is putting your request in writing. And we've included in here a sample letter that you can use as a template to make that request to your school district. Anytime you make that request, you want to include your child's name, their grade, and the school that they attend, especially in larger districts where they have multiple school buildings. And you want to make sure that you're providing a brief explanation about what specifically you're asking for, because in some cases, some of the areas of concern that you have cover multiple evaluations. So you want to make sure that you are requesting the right evaluation from your school district. Make sure that before you submit that request for an evaluation, you're keeping a copy for yourself, because all of these requests for evaluation come with a timeline. And keeping a copy for yourself will make sure that you're keeping track of those timelines and that you're keeping a paper trail for yourself so that you know where you're at in that process. You definitely want to make sure that you're following up with your school district within 5 days to ensure that they've received your request. Most of the time, they will contact you to initiate the consent to evaluate and make sure that you know what the next steps in that process will be. But if you haven't heard, it's always a good idea to follow up with them. And another important reminder, especially in areas where there's people with different multicultural backgrounds, is that schools are legally required to provide bilingual evaluations for students who are English language learners. And they must provide all documentation and information to the parent in their preferred language. So if you have a parent who is speaking a language other than English, it's important to know that they have the right to request copies of any evaluations in their native language. So at this point, you're probably saying, well, that's great, but I still don't know which evaluations to request. Well, in that letter of evaluation, you're requesting an evaluation to cover all areas of suspected disability. And that generally means that you're requesting a cognitive evaluation and then evaluations in different functional areas. Some evaluations, like I mentioned, provide information about multiple areas of functioning. So for instance, a speech evaluation might also cover how well language is understood and processed. And in that letter, you need to be able to describe your functional concerns briefly, but with enough detail so that you can narrow down those types of evaluations for the school district. So we're going to very quickly go through some of those evaluation areas. So if you have a concern about your child's ability to express their thoughts, feelings, and ideas, to understand and process what's being said to them, follow and execute multiple step directions, speak clearly, or produce spoken words in a way that makes sense, then you have the right to request a speech and language evaluation. Speech and language evaluations actually assess a number of different areas, not only in how well your child is able to talk, but in how well they are able to understand and take in language. So there's two functional areas that they look at for speech and language evaluations. They look at receptive language skills, meaning how well can they take in and understand spoken language, and expressive language skills, which is their ability to formulate and organize oral language and written language and be able to use that for functionality. Oftentimes with speech and language evaluations, they're also looking at phonological processing, which is basically looking at the sounds that letters and different sounds or different letters together make in order to produce speech, and articulation and auditory processing, as well as pragmatic speech, which is being able to use words in a way to be able to functionally communicate. Some of the most common assessments that they use for speech and language evaluations, especially for young kiddos, is the preschool language scales, or the PLS-5. Don't worry, there's no quiz on this. I'm not going to ask you to repeat what kind of evaluations they use, only it's important to know the names of the different assessments. And then there's also the clinical evaluation of language function, which is nicknamed the CELF, the CELF. And the gold standard for articulation testing is the Goldman-Fristow test of articulation. And again, that really tests letter sounds and letters in combination and the sounds that they make. The next area we're going to look at is physical abilities. So if you have concerns about your child's physical abilities, and this includes things like big muscle movements like walking, running, jumping, skipping, small muscle movements like being able to grasp small objects, balance, coordination, and sensory processing, then you're looking at either an occupational therapy evaluation or a physical therapy evaluation. Occupational therapy evaluations look at small motor movements. So these would be things like grasping movements, being able to hold pencils, as well as sensory processing, because sensory processing is often due to your internal sensory systems and being able to coordinate all of those things together to make your small muscle movements work. Physical therapy tends to look at large muscle movements. So it's things like walking, running, jumping, skipping, as well as balance and coordination and being able to get all of those big muscles moving together to do things in a functional sort of way. So if you have concerns about large muscle or small muscle movements or any of these other functional concerns, you have the right to request that occupational therapy or physical therapy evaluation. The one that most of us tend to think of when we're talking about any kind of evaluations or assessments with the school is the psychoeducational testing. And it's important to note that psychoeducational testing is more than just a measure of what you know. They're going to be assessing a number of different areas when they do psychoeducational testing. So this includes not only cognitive testing or IQ testing, but it also includes academic testing and how well your child is doing in the different functional academic areas. So a lot of times psychoeducational testing includes not only an IQ test, but it will include a social history as well. They really want to make sure that they know a detailed history about where your child came from, any developmental concerns, any possible issues with birth or congenital defects or genetic history, just so that they can rule out some possible concerns with your child's development. They're also going to look at things like cognitive abilities and how well your child is able to process information, both verbal and nonverbal reasoning skills, problem solving skills, and being able to put all of those things together in a functional way. They're also going to look at processing skills. So how quickly does the brain process information, take it in, and use it in a functional way? They're going to look at memory skills, including working memory, which working memory is how well you can take in information, hang on to it, and spit it back out when you're being asked to use that. And then, of course, we're also looking at our academic skills. And a lot of the academic achievement testing includes testing in reading, math, written expression, and language skills. So there's a number of different tests that schools will often use to assess both IQ and academic achievement. The one that we hear most often is called the WISC-5, and we've included the abbreviation as well as the actual name for the test so that you understand what the abbreviations mean. So if you ever hear WISC-5, it means the Wechsler's Intelligence Scale for Children, and it's the 5th version. The 5th version is the most up-to-date and most recent version. So you want to make sure that they are using the most recent version of that testing, because that's going to give you the most accurate information and the most closely norm-referenced information. For younger children, they often use the Wechsler's Preschool and Primary Scale of Intelligence. It's abbreviated as the WIPC-4, which is a fun thing to say. And once your child reaches the age of 16 and older, you can request a Wechsler's Intelligence or Adult Intelligence Scale, the 4th version, or the WAIS. The WAIS comes into play when you're looking at transitioning to life out of high school, because a lot of colleges and a lot of post-secondary institutions will look at the adult intelligence scales to find out where your child is at cognitively to assess whether they would need some additional supports. There is also the Kaufman intelligence test, and there's a brief version of it as well, and the Stanford Binet intelligence scales, which is used, but it's not as common as the WISC or some of the other testing. And then when we're looking at academic achievement testing, the Wechsler scale also has an academic component called the Wyatt 3. There's the Kaufman test of educational achievement, or the KTEA-3, and the Kaufman test of educational achievement brief, or the KTEA-3 brief. And we included the brief versions because it's important to note that schools will sometimes try to substitute the brief version when a full version is actually needed in order to fully assess skills. Brief versions should only be used if a full scale or a full test has been used previously, and all parties can agree that the brief version is appropriate to use in this particular case. So I'll use my son Wyatt as an example. He is 18 and he has gone through a number of years of different cognitive testing. And about after the third or fourth time that he was assessed in his cognitive skills, we kind of agreed that none of his testing was going to move significantly in one direction or another. So at that point, we had decided that using the brief version of testing would be appropriate for him because we didn't need to put him through a full battery of testing to find the same information. But they did ask permission in order to use the brief version before they went ahead and used that as an assessment. So make sure you know what kind of assessment they're using for your child before you agree to that being used. At this point, I am going to turn it over to Jed Schwartz, and she's going to talk to us about neuropsych evaluations.
Hi. So the neuropsychological is probably my favorite evaluation. It's very misunderstood. From my experience, a lot of districts either don't do them willingly, don't understand what they are, and or don't really see the point in doing them. So neuropsychological is a really good evaluation. It's comprehensive. It does like a lot of different assessments within one evaluation. You never ask for it right off the bat. You should probably, you need to have like psychoed testing done to have an understanding as to where the student is. Neuropsychs come in handy when you have a student who either has a disability and is receiving services through the school already, but isn't really making progress in certain areas. When that happens, a lot of times schools will either increase the amount of time they're getting a particular support, or they will add extra supports for the same sort of deficit. So if you have a student who is classified with a learning disability, because they have deficits in reading, if after a year that child still isn't progressing with reading, it seems like, the thing to do would be to double up on the reading services for the following year. The problem with that is that if you don't understand why that child's not making progress in reading, it doesn't matter how many services you throw at that child or how long the services are. If they're not addressing the root of the problem, the services are never going to help the deficits. So neuropsych evaluations, they not only identify that there are deficits, they will identify what's causing that deficit. So, for example, we were working with a student who had not made progress in reading in some time, and the school kept saying, like, why a neuropsych? We know they can't read. Like, what do you need that for? So ultimately, we were able to get a neuropsych, and it turned out that the student had dyslexia and he had ADHD. So there was some more, insight as to why, like the, AIS reading service or whatever was provided wasn't really helping him. So if you're not sure, like what the problem is or what's causing the deficits, ask for a neuropsych. And if you have testing that's done that shows there's no signs of a disability, but your child or the student that you're working with just isn't progressing in areas, that's a good time to ask for a neuropsych as well. Okay, so we're going to look at behaviors. We're going to talk about the Behavior Assessment System for Children, otherwise known as the BASC, the Connors Rating Scale, and the Functional Behavior Assessment, which is known as the FBA. So the BASC is a set of rating scales and forms that are usually completed by parents, teachers, and the student themselves, depending upon the age. and it helps to sort of provide some clinical information in terms of what could be causing symptoms that are seen in the school setting, seen at home, experienced by the, the student themselves. And then you can, you bring that information together to have a conversation. You can see which areas are impacting that child in all areas, in all settings, and at what levels. So the BASC asks different questions to find out information about different symptoms that are occurring for that student. Oh, wait, can we go? Nope. There we go. Okay. Talk about different symptoms. So the questions they ask aren't like, oh, do you think your child has a problem with inattention? Do you think your child is impulsive? Do you think your child is depressed? They're a little bit more savvy than that. They will ask questions like, does your child lose their temper very easily at home? Does your child throw, a tantrum when they're asked to do things that maybe they don't like? So they kind of disguise the questions. Scales are then assessed in 3 different areas, or 3 different ways. Average, which means the symptom for that student is seen a typical amount, like the same amount as students their age. The symptoms can be considered at risk, which means the student experiences them at a slightly higher level than other students. And then there's a clinically significant range. And that means that the symptom is impacting the student at a level that's really significantly higher than students at the same age and level. So just to give you an example, we took a BASC to look at the symptoms that were endorsed in the clinically significant or the at-risk range by parents. So we have inattention, low self-esteem, impulsivity, depression, anxiety, learning problems, and hyperactivity. Then we took scores for the same student that were assessed by the teacher, and the symptoms that came up clinically significant or at risk by the teachers was the attitude to school, attitude to teachers, learning problems, aggression, hyperactivity, impulsivity, and low self-esteem. And then we take a look at how the student answered their questions, and these were some of the symptoms that the student, through their questions came up as clinically significant or at risk. Attitude to school, attitude to teachers, inattention, learning problems, hyperactivity, impulsivity, and low self-esteem. So once you collect all that information from everyone, you put it together, and you find that there are more often than not symptoms that are endorsed at the same level by all 3 people, or whatever the number of teachers filling out the forms are. So in this case, the symptoms that were endorsed as clinically significant or at risk by the teachers, the parent, and the student were inattention, low self-esteem, learning problems, impulsivity, and hyperactivity. And when you have those overlapping symptoms, it kind of gives you a good point to sort of narrow in on and see where the priority should be or what the focus should be on in terms of what's really impacting that student. Okay, so now we have the Conners rating scale. It's very similar to the BASC. It's specifically used to get a red flag for ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Same concept. It's completed by parents and teachers, students when it's appropriate for their age. And like I said, it helps to identify and measure symptoms related to ADHD and the frequency or the significance of those symptoms for that student. It also asks about those symptoms in all areas of life. So it's not just a focus on school, but how they are and how they behave and feel at home, social gatherings, and work. And the point is to try to find a pattern regarding the symptoms that pop up the most, related to ADHD. It is important to note that although a Conners can be conducted by the school, and it should be if these concerns are coming up, school districts cannot diagnose a student with ADHD. They can't diagnose a student with anything. They can, again, use these tools to sort of help inform the decisions that they're making. Parents will often do the Conners because the school has provided it, but then they're able to take that to either their pediatrician for an official diagnosis, or parents can use the Conners, and we'll get to this evaluation shortly, for a psychiatric evaluation to get a diagnosis of either ADHD or anything else that psychiatrist might think is impacting that student. All right, so functional behavior assessment. FBA. So again, it focuses on behaviors. If your student is having a hard time with social skills, if they are getting suspended seemingly all the time, if you're constantly getting like progress report notes or report card notes, like they're insubordinate, they don't follow directions, they don't do what they're supposed to do, just ask for an FBA. So what is an FBA? It's an ongoing and continuous assessment of a student's behavior. So the point of this is to identify the possible causes of the behaviors, to observe the behaviors in terms of how frequent they're happening, and then ultimately to discuss a hypothesis or, try to figure out like why you think those behaviors are happening. Why an FBA? So it's nearly impossible to try to stop or prevent a behavior from happening if you don't know why it's happening. So the information that is collected from an FBA, like I said, is used to identify patterns of behavior, to try to figure out what's happening right before the behavior happens. The thinking being that if you can prevent or eliminate the trigger of the behaviors, that student won't have the behaviors. So when should the FBA be conducted? So really, best practice would be over the span of 3-4 weeks throughout the school day. By throughout the school day, I mean in the morning, in the afternoons, during unstructured times, during different academic settings. If you have an FBA, they could take data for 6 weeks, but if they always go into, Jessica's classroom at 9 o'clock in the morning and they leave at 9:30, that's giving you data about what her day looks like for that specific half-hour period of time. You really need to have data collected from different parts of the day. So the data and information should be collected, like I said, from a variety of settings within the school building: academic classrooms, specialty classrooms, hallways, lunchtime, recess. The point is really to get a good picture, not just like the time of day, but what's happening during that time of day. So students may do really well when they're in a structured environment like your classroom and have no behaviors, but then always have behaviors that lead to problems when they're in unstructured settings like the lunchroom or at recess. Or the flip side of that can happen. They might be completely fine changing classes or walking through the halls by themselves, but they have a behavior without fail, every single day in the afternoon, but only during reading time. So it's important to know like what is happening when those behaviors are occurring. And who does the FBA? So not one person is responsible for the data for the FBA, although you will have one person who's like the delegated point person to collect data from other sources. Typically, the school psychologist will be the person to do like in-school observations. They're supposed to be subtle about it. They kind of act like they're there to, observe the classroom in general. They talk to other students, but really they're watching the child that they're doing the FBA for. The psychologist also, though, is collecting information from that student's classroom teachers, from specials, from aides or paraprofessionals who are in the classroom. Anyone who comes into contact with that student during the school day should be providing information to the psychologist. In addition, parents are also like an integral part of this because they hear about what happens from their child, like after school. They see what their kids are doing at home during homework time, which is, it's happening at home. But again, if you have a problem with reading, you're having this behavior every day during reading, you're probably having behaviors at home when you're doing that work as well. So it's a group process. So we have the Behavior Intervention Plan, better known as the BIP. So this is going to be just really brief because I believe there are plans to maybe do another sort of webinar that focuses more specifically on the behaviors and behavior intervention plans. But, an FBA is great, but what do you do with the information that you collect from that? So if it warrants, you create a behavior intervention plan. So the point of the behavior intervention plan is to really address the individual students' behaviors that are impacting either their education or the education of the students around them. The BIP has to include like positive behavioral intervention strategies and supports, and it's really important to get information and feedback from not only the parent, but from the student as well. People have different ideas in terms of what a strategy or support is, or what would, work to motivate a student. If you have a 12-year-old student and your idea of, positive behavior reward is a sticker at the end of the day, not a lot of 12-year-olds are going to buy into that or think that that's something to be really excited about. And then also doing something at the end of the day might not help a student who has problems, throughout the day. Like, it's really hard to rein yourself in when you're getting something at the end of the day. I feel like if you mess up and you have a behavior first thing in the morning, like that reward is out the window now. It should provide a roadmap for how to reduce the problem behaviors, again, based on the information that was collected through the FBA. And I think what's most important about the BIP is that every teacher or adult that interacts with that child during the school day, needs to understand that, one, there is a BIP in place. Two, they need to know what that BIP says. And three, everyone needs to be on board and responding to the same situation in the same kind of way. So if it's in the behavior plan that, if Johnny, has some sort of meltdown or a tantrum, and the intervention that you're supposed to do is give him 3 minutes to kind of cool down and relax with a nonverbal cue. So giving him a look. So that's great if the classroom teacher knows that that's what you need to do. But then if Johnny goes out into the hallway and has some kind of meltdown and someone starts screaming at him, that's very inconsistent, and it doesn't work as well as it really should. So the next evaluation, and I mentioned this earlier, is a psychiatric evaluation. So it's important to understand that symptoms of mental illness very often look different in children than they do in adults. And I think that's hard for parents to understand. And I think it's hard for teachers as adults and other educators to understand. I think as adults, we hear maybe depression, and then we think of someone who is laying in bed all day with their curtains drawn and everything's black and they're not eating and they're not getting out of bed. Depression can look very different in a child. It can look like someone who isn't going to school. When kids don't go to school, I think the jump to very easily is that they're just being defiant, or they're willfully choosing to not go because they feel like being defiant. For the most part, I think kids go to school because they like going to school. It's their main outlet really for social interaction. So out of 100 kids, if you have 99 who are going to school, the one kid who's not going to school, I can assure you it's not because he's sitting at home saying, F this, I'm not going to school. I don't have to go to school. Maybe take a deeper look into what's going on. Oftentimes, there's a lot of somatic complaints. Kids will complain of stomach aches, headaches, feeling nauseous, but really it's specific sort of to having to go to school. And that can be used against kids sometimes. We talk about it at meetings and they'll say, well, I saw, and this is a real story, the principal was in a meeting and he's like, well, I don't know how you're saying he's anxious because I saw him at Barnes & Noble over the weekend. And we were like, great, he was at a bookstore over the weekend. That doesn't mean that he doesn't have an anxiety disorder that is, specific to school. So, yes. So ask for psychiatric evaluations. If you're just not sure, what's going on with your kid, if you've noticed that there are, they used to be super involved and participate in a lot of clubs and sports and they just don't care anymore, excuse me, you should take a look at that. And also, of course, if there are behaviors that result in disciplinary actions like long-term out-of-school suspensions, you have the right to ask for a psychiatric evaluation through the Committee on Special Ed, so they will pay for it. And then the CSE needs to reconvene once the eval is done and talk about it and see what the recommendations are for your student.
All right, so now we're going to take a look at assistive technology. And having lived through an assistive technology evaluation, it's a very lengthy process, but it's actually very beneficial for kids who need assistive technology provided for them. And assistive technology evaluations are provided to students who are doing okay, but we expect the student to be able to do something within their educational program, but they're not able to because of their disability. So a good example of this would be, again, my son Wyatt was nonverbal for a number of years during his education, and we discovered that he was able to take in a lot of information. His receptive language skills were really, really good, but he just had a really hard time being able to express himself. So his speech and language therapist said, I think he would be a really great candidate for an augmentative communication device. And I said, well, what does that mean? And she said, well, what that means is we need to do an assistive technology evaluation. So an assistive technology evaluation, very briefly, consists of an assistive technology or an AT specialist consulting with the team, meaning anyone working with that student, including the parents, to look into areas that the student needs any kind of support. And they would do this by looking at what's called the SET framework. And SET stands for Student, Environment, Task, and Tools. So using that SET framework, they're going to start collecting data to see what does the student need and what are the student's current abilities and what areas do they have deficits. What environments do they possibly need some assistive technology support in? What tasks are we looking for that student to be able to accomplish, particularly those tasks associated with their IEP goals? And what tools do we need, both low tech, no tech, and high tech, that we can put in place for the student to be able to help them reach those IEP goals? Once we've done that assessment and we've kind of taken a look at the different areas and the different pieces of technology that might be able to assist the student, then we enter into a process of trial and error where we put specific tools in place and then we collect data to see if that tool is working. So we want to try different types of technology and see, is this working for the student? Is this not working? And it needs to be across a number of different areas, and it needs to be over a number of different trials. It's not enough for an assistive technology evaluation to try it once with a student and say, oh, well, I guess that didn't work, on to the next step. We really have to be trying this with the student and making sure that we're actually teaching the student how to use the device and get meaningful benefit from it.
Before you go on, we just had a question pop up, and I'm not sure if you can see them because I know you're sharing the slides, asking you to just go over again once more what that SET stands for.
Sure. SET is an acronym, or not an acronym. I don't know what the word is, but SET stands for Student, Environment, Task, and Tools.
That's an acronym.
It's an acronym.
Yeah.
So after that data is collected, then we look to formalize the plan, because by that point, we've got enough information to be able to say that, this particular piece of technology is working and it's beneficial. So that piece of technology is formalized into the student's IEP. And with that, there's also included in the student's IEP regular check-ins from the AT specialist, whether that's with the parent to provide some additional training and education, or with the student and the classroom teacher to make sure that expectations aren't changing and that they are still able to use that piece of technology to the best extent possible for educational benefit. And again, it can be as high tech as using these very advanced computer models that are on the screen, or as low tech as using a pencil grip to be able to modify how a child is holding onto a pencil so that they are able to write appropriately. So we've got all these evaluations and we've got all this data, and that's great, but what does this data mean? Well, in order to understand what this data means, we really have to take a look at some of the subtests. And we're going to start by looking at the subtests for the WISC and the Wyatt in particular. Now, there are a number of different types of intelligence tests and achievement tests. I think I saw in the chat earlier the Woodcock Johnson. And yes, that is another type of test that is used for achievement. There's a number of different ones out there. If you're not sure if that test is appropriate for the student, just Google it. Google will give you the answer whether that is an appropriate norm reference test for that particular age category for that student. We're just using the WISC and the Wyatt because these are the most popular versions of those tests. So under each test, there are different subtests that they use in order to collect information to get a composite score to give you that full scale IQ or the full scale functioning ability. So under the WISC, there's verbal comprehension, and verbal comprehension looks at the knowledge of words and being able to apply them. Some of those subtests are verbal concept formation, reasoning, and expression. There's also visual spatial reasoning, and that includes seeing visual details, understanding spatial concepts and construction ability, understanding the relationship between parts and a whole, and integrating visual and motor skills. So if you've ever seen a WISC being implemented from a school psychologist, this particular test is the one where they show a student a picture of a block design and then give them a number of blocks and say, hey, can you recreate this with the blocks that are in front of you? Just because they want to see if that student is able to take what they're seeing and then translate that into a different format. Fluid reasoning is being able to see meaningful relationship between visual objects. So fluid reasoning, I know Tyler, my youngest, was recently evaluated, and they would do things like show him 4 pictures and say, which one does not belong in this picture? And it would be 3 dogs and a cat. So fluid reasoning would be being able to say, well, the cat doesn't belong because the cat is not a dog. Working memory skills are, again, being able to take in very basic information, hold on to it for a short amount of time, and being able to use that. So with working memory, they will often do things like sequencing numbers. So they will give the student a sequence of numbers and ask them to repeat those numbers or repeat them backwards, just to see if they are able to hang on to that information.
I just want to add real quick with the sequencing of numbers and repeating it forwards and repeating it backwards. A lot of times schools will be very impressed when students can repeat numbers backwards better than they can repeat them forwards. I think that actually shows somewhat of a weakness in working memory, because when you're hearing, say, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and you have to repeat it backwards, the last numbers you heard were 6, 5, and 4, not 1, 2, and 3. And that was a very simple example. That isn't really what they ask, but the kids who hear those numbers last can repeat them backwards better than forwards, because their working memory allows them to do that, but not go far back enough to repeat them in the correct, forwards order.
And then they also look at processing speed, and processing speed is really one of those lesser known but really important things to be aware of, because processing speed will really change IQ scores. And if your child is a fast processor, a lot of times that means that they're processing information really quickly, but it's not necessarily accurate. And then if they process slowly, that means that it takes them a long time to get to the right answer. But by the time they've gotten to that right answer, the rest of the class is 5 questions ahead of them. So processing speed is something to really pay attention to when we're looking at these subtests.
And also with processing speed, for when they're testing it through the WISC, there's no academic information involved whatsoever. There's no words involved. They're shown pictures, and they've got to scan through and, pick out the one that doesn't belong or pick out the one that has similar symbols. And, when kids will score high in the processing speed area, schools will say this is a real area of strength, and it is completely. But if your other scores are lower, essentially when when you have to do classwork, it doesn't matter how quickly you can work. If you don't have, the knowledge base for the work that you need to be doing it quickly means nothing. So just keep that in mind.
Thanks for that. And then when we're looking at the achievement test scores, again, this is breaking down some of the core subject area material that students need to be learning and breaking it into these subtests to determine what kind of information they're actually taking in and able to understand. So there's an oral language composite and then a total reading composite, as well as reading comprehension and fluency. And with those reading questions on the subtests, they're looking at how well can they understand language, how well can they read language, and how much can they make sense of the information that they've read. And with fluency, how quickly can they read it and how accurately can they read that information?
Yeah, anytime you see the word fluency on a subtest for achievement testing, it means that test is timed. So you might have really high reading comprehension score or the ability to read words, but if your reading fluency is really low, it means you read very slowly.
And then they also include written expression, and then math and math fluency. And again, math is usually how well do they understand the concepts, and then fluency is how quickly can they compute that information. So I'm looking at time, and I just want to get through these next few slides very quickly so we have lots of time for question and answer. So again, the subtests really are to determine how the child thinks, processes information, and remembers what they have previously been taught. So we're going to give you a crash course now in statistics. And in order to really understand how to read and understand the testing, you really do have to understand statistics a little bit. You don't have to be an expert, but you do have to understand what the scores mean. So a lot of times when you are given scores, you're given scores in one of these 6 different areas. The 2 least accurate scores, and the 2 that I don't like to see the most, are age equivalent and grade equivalent. Age equivalent is they will take that score and they will compare that student's score against other students around that same age. And really what that means is that it's a developmental kind of assessment. So for Tyler, my youngest, he was doing things at 2 years old that were kind of testing him that showed he was at like an 18-month level. But it wasn't accurate enough for me because kids develop at different levels and different rates. So just because he was behind in different areas didn't mean that he was necessarily behind or showing a deficit. It was just he hadn't developed that skill set yet. So age equivalent does give you information, but it's not necessarily accurate information.
I would say I agree completely. The younger the kids are, but as they get older, like into middle school and high school, they should be done with their developmental stages in terms of learning. So if you have, a 9th grader who is 14 years old and you get scores back with the grade equivalent of a 5th grade and an age equivalent of 8 years old, that's a problem. That's not developmental. So that can, change depending on how old the student is.
Absolutely. The 2 scores that we tend to see the most often are standard scores and raw scores. Standard scores are usually for our larger tests. So like that will be your full scale IQs and some of the subtests that you get from that testing. And then your subtest scores tend to be the raw scores. So if you're looking, the standard score is listed across the bottom of this bell curve that we've listed here on this slide. And standard scores between 85 and 115 are considered in the average range. And you want to look for scores within this range, mainly because it indicates that the student is within the average range as far as their achievement goes. Now, we will talk a little bit more about looking for discrepancies in just a moment, but I really want you to understand that when you're seeing scores between 85 and 115, this typically indicates that they're achieving within the average range. And then, so for looking at raw scores is looking at this. I don't know if the raw scores are on here. Anyways, raw scores are usually listed between 0 and 7 and 10, or 7 and 13, sorry, 7 and 13 are considered in the average range for raw scores. Percentile rankings are great, but again, percentile rankings aren't necessarily accurate as far as parents are concerned, and it's hard for parents to kind of wrap their heads around sometimes percentile rankings, because percentile rankings are comparing your child to about 100 other kids who took the same assessment. So if your child is achieving in, say, the 50th percentile, it sounds kind of scary hearing 50th percentile, but 50th actually means like they're right smack dab in the middle. So they're actually doing pretty well compared to all the other kids that took that same assessment. Likewise, if they're scoring in the 2nd percentile, that's something to really kind of start considering that there might be some issues or concerns there.
And just real quick, in terms of percentile, I know we're very used to hearing 100%, like you're the best. But when you look at the percentiles here, imagine it as like 0 to 100 being there's 100 kids taking like the same test who's the same age as your child or, you know, in the same grade. And so a percentile, if you score in the 84th percentile, it means for that particular subtest, you've scored higher than 84 other kids who took that test. So if you score in the 3rd percentile, it means you scored higher than like 3 kids who took that test. Sorry.
No, you're good. And then standard deviation is particularly important when you're looking at eligibility scores. Standard deviations tell you how far away from the average range you are as far as your scores go. So this is that line that's right here at the bottom of the bell curve. So as you get further away from the average range or right smack dab in the middle, you're seeing that you're getting further and further away as far as standard deviations go. So -1 standard deviation and +1 standard deviation are still considered that average range, and that's the sweet spot that we're looking for as far as those scores go. But as we get further away, anything that's in this -2 standard, or between -1 and -2 standard deviations below, we're really looking at scores between 70 and 85 as far as standard scores go. And this typically indicates that they're low average or below average, and they have some minor impairments or some mild delays that need to be addressed. And then anything below 2 standard deviations typically indicates that there's a severe impairment or a significant delay. And that's usually anything between 55 and 70 as far as a standard score goes. And those scores, again, indicate that there's a significant delay. Now, it's important to note that students can also achieve above the standard deviation scores or above the normal range. And this can also present a problem in a classroom because exceptionality can also be a hindrance. So students who process and learn information quickly can often be bored or act out in a classroom. Or again, as Jen mentioned, they might have a really high processing score, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're able to understand all the information that they're taking in. So really pay attention to scores that are in this +1 to +2 to +3 range as far as standard deviation scores allow. So again, just a little statement, evaluation scores in the average range typically indicate that there is no delay or concern. But what we're going to pay attention to is more on this next slide. So that's great. What do I do with all that information? Well, we're going to give you a handout after this presentation that actually gives you a blank bell curve. And so when you're working with families, you can start plotting this information to kind of help families understand what this information looks like and how it applies to their child. So if we were to take all the subtests from the WISC-5 and plot these on this bell curve, we're going to see that their verbal comprehension or their fluid reasoning score is an 88, their verbal comprehension score is an 84, their visual spatial reasoning scores is a 78, their working memory is a 67, their processing speed is a 77. And when you put all of these scores together, that gives them a full scale IQ of a 73. Now, one of the first things that you're going to notice when you're putting all of these scores on the scale, and again, these are all based on that very bottom line of the standard scores, is that there's lots of scores that are up in this range that are kind of clustered together. Anything that's more than about 10 points different is when you start going, that doesn't seem right. I wonder why those scores are so far apart. And that comes into play particularly with this working memory score. To me, that means that that student is taking in information, but they're not able to hang on to it for a long period of time. And that really is bringing down that full scale IQ score and affecting that child's ability to process and hang on to information. And they might need lots of reteaching and lots of time relearning material. So if we were to do the same thing with academic testing, we throw all these points up there on the scale with the letter and word recognition of a 53, their math composite score of a 70, their computation scores of 75, their concepts and application score of a 68, the reading composite of a 55, reading comprehension of a 64, and their spelling at a 55. All of these together compared to their full scale IQ from the WISC-5 of a 73. Well, we're getting lots of scores that are kind of clustered together in that same little pocket, which is great because that means that more than likely those scores are kind of accurate for this particular student. But I would want to pay attention to these scores that are here down in the 55 to, or 53 to 55 range, because that indicates to me that that student possibly has some learning difficulties, particularly with being able to read, being able to spell or hear the sounds in different words, and being able to recognize that different letters and different words have different sounds and meanings. Now, we're not expecting you guys to become experts in being able to be statistic analysts. We're not, and we're not expecting that from you either. What we want you to do is be able to take the big picture of putting all of these scores together on a map, and then being able to look at what the big picture is telling you as far as what all of these scores mean. So I'm just clicking the button now to put all of these scores up here on our map. And what we're looking at is some of these outliers, and these outliers give us lots of information about what's going on with this particular student. So this particular student, we're looking at their visual spatial skills that are really high. That might suggest to me that this kid is a really great visual learner. Same thing with this button up here. So they're a really great visual learner, but we're also seeing that they're struggling with reading, and they're having a really hard time being able to process written language and oral language. So maybe we want to focus on doing some testing for a learning disability. But that doesn't mean that you need to know what all of those scores mean. It just means that if something doesn't make sense, you need to start asking questions. Why are these scores so high here compared to the rest of them? Why are these scores so low here compared to the rest of them? What does this mean for my student as far as how they are learning in the classroom setting? So again, the bottom line about scores, look for what doesn't make sense. We want to look for discrepancies. Do the different scores look similar, or are there noticeable gaps from test to test? Does it match what you're seeing in the classroom? If your student is struggling, but the test looks okay, then maybe we need to look at doing something else, or maybe there's something else going on that we need to get some more information about. Trust your gut, and this is something I tell every single parent I'm working with. If there's something missing from the picture, then we need to figure out what's missing, and we need to be able to ask those questions about why is this does not match up with what I'm seeing. And if you can't quite put your finger on it, now is the time to request that additional testing if it's needed.
And real quick, so when we're talking about discrepancies, you can look for discrepancies from test to test. So you can look between like the WISC-5 and the Wyatt, or the WISC-5 and a speech language evaluation, because the numbers, for the most part, they mean the same thing. If you score in the 50th percentile on one assessment, scoring in the 50th percentile on another assessment means you're doing like the same in both areas. So if you have a full scale IQ of, let's say, 100, which falls at the 50th percentile, but in some of your achievement testing, you're scoring at the 5th percentile, even though it's not the same test, you should be making that connection that, well, wait a minute, if this student is capable cognitively of performing like completely average, why are they reading so far below average? And you can look for discrepancies within the same assessment. So if you have a full scale IQ of, again, 100, if you have a verbal comprehension that's 105 and visual spatial then 95, and I don't know, something else of 120, your working memory is a 60, you add those up together to find the average. It might be 100, but you have an area of your brain functioning that is so far below what the rest of your brain is doing, that's a problem. And then the other thing to keep in mind is a lot of times students will test well in these one-on-one situations, and that's really important. They're one-on-one situations. They're able to have breaks. some of the parts of, some of the assessments are timed, but not the overwhelming majority of them are sort of untimed. And that's very different than being in a classroom where you have 40 minutes to complete an assessment. You don't get to ask questions. You can't say you don't understand something. They won't repeat anything for you. And you have, 20, 25, 30 other kids around you. So if anything about being in a group setting impacts your ability to take a test or to work quickly or anything like that, that could explain why they're testing okay in a one-on-one situation, but maybe failing, a number of their classes.
So there is something that you can do if you disagree with the testing. So there is a safeguard in place for parents called the Independent Educational Evaluation. And independent educational evaluations mean that you disagree with the evaluation that's been performed for the student and that you would like what I call the educational equivalent of a second opinion. So when you are requesting an independent educational evaluation, you want to put this in writing. And again, we've included a sample letter that you can use to make that request of school districts. Once you submit that to school districts, they will oftentimes send you a list of evaluators from the school district. This is not all inclusive. If you have an evaluator that fits within the criteria of an independent educational evaluator, you may use that evaluator as long as you're informing the school district that they meet that same criteria. And you, once that's completed, you ideally compare that information from the independent educational evaluation to the original evaluation to see if they match up. And if they don't, what information are you getting from that second evaluation that will give you a little bit clearer picture of what's going on with that student? And it's important to note that when you're requesting an independent educational evaluation, it is at public expense, meaning that the school district is the one who's paying for that evaluation. So we have heard from school districts before saying, we'd be happy to provide you an independent educational evaluation. Just let us know what part of that your insurance is going to cover.
Right. Or let us know how much it costs, lay out the money, send us the bill, and then we'll pay you back. A public expense does not mean you pay me back. It doesn't mean I'm going to submit my insurance and, let you know what you owe me, the balance of. The school district has to pay for it upfront or whatever the provider, requires in full. Money is never exchanged through the parent. And I know we touched upon, qualifications for someone to do an IEE. So for example, if you have a speech and language evaluation that the school has done and you don't agree with it and you request it as an IEE, they just need to make sure that the person that they would like to do the evaluation has the, appropriate credentials or certification to actually perform that evaluation. And the only other caveat to being able to pick anyone you want is what that evaluator charges for the evaluation. There's sort of a going rate for different evaluations that you can most likely find in your school district's Board of Ed policy. And as long as you're within that range of what the evaluation costs or what the districts pay for it when they're the ones to perform it, they have to approve the evaluation or there's an impartial hearing.
So some key takeaways from today's presentation is always put your request in writing. If you didn't put your request in writing, it didn't happen. And that's a great way to kind of safeguard yourself to make sure that you know what evaluations you've requested.
So you should know what evaluations that you need to have done or that you're going to be requesting. And you need to really be able to understand why you're requesting them, which is why we have gone through all of them to help you better understand them in some lay language. It's very easy for someone to submit a letter saying, I would like A, B, C, D, E, and F evaluations done because they just don't know what the evaluations do. And districts will sometimes not give a lot of merit to that request for evaluations because you've sort of picked every evaluation under the sun. If you feel that you need all those evaluations done for your child, that's totally fine. Go ahead and request all of them. You should have an understanding as to why though, so you can, explain that in the conversation with the school district.
And again, we're not expecting you to be expert data analysts. We're just expecting you to be able to understand what that data means and be able to talk about what it tells you about your child's functioning. So if you're seeing things that don't make sense to you, you want to be able to ask questions about that data and be able to bring that information to the rest of the committee and say, help me understand why this is saying what it's saying here.
And even if you don't completely understand what the data is saying, if you can, at the very least, understand that a score of 110 does not look like a score of 60, that's enough. Like, just ask questions. Oh, right, every other. Okay. If you disagree, you have options. Sorry. So, yeah, if you disagree with the evaluations that are done, you have the option to ask for an independent. You can also ask to have a meeting, like, stopped or rescheduled. Reach out to an advocate, reach out to a parent center, someone to better help you and assist you with the process. So, yeah, and the CSE process is fluid. So whatever is decided in the meeting, that's not going to be forever. Request another meeting as soon as you feel like that's necessary. If something changes, request a meeting. They have to schedule meetings anytime you put that request in writing for a meeting.
So I think at this point in time, we can go ahead and open it up to questions.
Yeah, we can. So thank you guys. This is really informative and helpful. And, folks were asking some good questions during the chat. So I want to reintroduce, I mentioned Mona Ganame earlier. Mona is with Families Together in New York State. And actually, she may have had to leave because I know she has to leave early. But Mona, if you're there, you can turn your camera on.
I'm still here to go through a couple. I'm still here.
Still here. Okay. Maybe Mona, why don't you start and pick one of the questions off our list and pose it to
Sure.
our panelists.
So the first one is, can a speech teacher complete a speech and language evaluation?
So typically, speech evaluation is completed by a speech and language pathologist. Speech teachers can do assessments, but they are generally done under the supervision of a pathologist. So I would make sure that you know the credentials of the person that is conducting the evaluation, and make sure that a pathologist is the one that's supervising the evaluation and going over the results with the parent.
Oh, you know what? I forgot a critical person. Roselia Watkins is also here with us to answer questions. Sorry about that, Roselia. I just saw you in my corner of my eye on the screen. So Roselia is with Vibrant Emotional Health, and she's part of our team, and she's also here to weigh in. So we have another question, which is bilingual testing the same as the English testing? And do they use the same tools? So are all of those tools that you mentioned translated into Spanish and potentially other languages?
So evaluations, yes, they have bilingual, like, I don't know, alternate versions of them, where it's sort of, I don't want to say word for word or loosely, because I'm not sure to the extent, but the questions and the information that they're asking for has been translated into that native language of, whatever the student is. Every time you have a bilingual evaluation, though, there's always like this caveat expression at the bottom to make sure everyone knows that the norms, the statistical norms that they'll be using to sort of reference how this student did compared to other students, it's not culturally normed. So they say, maybe don't rely exclusively on the testing, because there are cultural things that go into these tests that are not normed for people who did not either grow up in America or did not grow up with English as their first language, if that made sense.
It did. I think sometimes the same question is asked even for kids who speak English, right? And there's always that question about how relevant are some of these tests for kids of color. So there's a question here about the Woodcock Johnson, which Jen, you did address and said, yes, that's another test that's out there. You just hadn't mentioned it because it's not as commonly used.
Right.
The person asking the question is just wondering if, is there a reason it's less commonly used? And I think probably the more general question behind that is, how is your average person to know whether an instrument that's being used is a quality instrument?
So there's a number of different tests that schools use, and they pick ones based on whatever fits the needs of their particular school district. So Some of them tests are more cost efficient to have them purchase one particular test over another. There are some that are more culturally appropriate for their particular region over another test. There's really, it's really up to your particular school district as to why they chose that particular test. And it's absolutely appropriate for you as a parent to ask them, you know, why this particular test over another one. And if you have a concern about whether that test is appropriate to be used, you know, I got a lot of my information for the different subtests and the different evaluations just by going to Google to find out, is this a nationally recognized norm reference test that they use for academic achievement and intelligence testing? So I would start with Google, and then if that doesn't give you enough information, feel free to ask your school district why this particular test, and you know, what information should I be looking for compared to other tests that are out there and available.
The other thing I would say is that it left my head, but the second part of what I was going to say was that it's not I remember. So really, I think for the most part, as long as they're not doing a brief evaluation, the information is going to be good information or valid, useful information. It's helpful, though, that not every district uses the same evaluation, or that more than one type of evaluation exists, because when you do disagree with an evaluation and you want an independent done, many of those tests cannot be given a second time within a 12-month period. So if you disagree with the psychological evaluation and they did like the WISC-5 and you want an independent done, if only the WISC-5 was available, you'd be waiting 12 months to have like that test done again. So it's not a bad thing.
So in New York City relies mostly on the Woodcock Johnson testing. That's the choice of the entire district of New York City. And what's interesting is that sometimes when you have a private evaluation done, they will still do an education evaluation component, administer the Woodcock Johnson, because some of the numbers are appropriate for New York City usage. Like there's some, we need a lot of norm reference data that sometimes may not be available with other testing. And also criterion reference testing in regards to grades.
What if the client just has behavioral issues? Should that test be asked for instead of everything else? And I suppose that could be, if there's just one specific thing that is problematic, do you just test for that, or you ask for everything?
I would think if you're looking to go through CSE, I typically they will do the psychoeducational testing no matter what. I always think it's super important to have as much testing information as possible, almost especially when you have behaviors, because the root of behaviors could be so many different things. We see so many kids, at least on Long Island, who have these acting out or behavior problems, come the end of middle school or high school. And when you do the testing, turns out like they can't read. So all this time they've just been sort of acting out or being the class clown or, avoiding things to not have to have some spotlight on them in their classes, like, oh, I'm the one who can't read, or, to avoid being called on in an academic situation. So they will act out to take the focus off of that. So yeah, I think behaviors are never just behaviors. There's always something underlying, and it's hard to understand what without all the information, and it's really hard to sort of help that kid if there's missing information.
And to piggyback off that, behavior is communication. And so for a lot of our kids who maybe don't have those same skills to express, I'm acting out and angry because of X, Y, and Z, those behavior scales are super important as far as shining a spotlight on things that maybe you wouldn't think would be a reason for behavior. So I always say, no kid gets out of bed in the morning and says, I'm going to go to school and make my teacher's life the worst day possible. So behavior is communicating something. And as the adults in the environment, it's our job to figure out what that is. And so just as Jen said, any data that you can collect from that environment is good information and just shines a spotlight on what's going on with that kiddo.
And real quick, I'm sorry, we had a student who was being suspended constantly, and the parent kept requesting a neuropsych, mostly because the school hadn't done any updated psychoed testing in 5 years, and he was classified OHI without ever having a diagnosis of ADHD. And the school kept saying, we can't even touch, his learning process till we get these behaviors under control. And we were like, how do you know that, like, his academics and his intelligence, like, you know nothing about, like, where he's functioning. So how do you know that they're not related? And they were so, like, stuck to this idea that, no, he needs a psychiatric, he needs a behavior plan. And maybe he did. But ultimately, a neuropsych was done. And guess what? He had dyslexia and he had ADHD, which the school had surmised, but never really taken a deeper look at, and was functioning at like 3 or 4 grade levels below where he was, which was 8th grade. So yeah, those behaviors completely connected to the fact that he wasn't learning.
And was stressed. There was a question here, which I'll ask now since you mentioned dyslexia, which is, what would be the best testing to request to identify dyslexia beyond the neuropsych? Is there anything that folks should specifically request?
So New York State is interesting in that in schools, they don't specifically test for a specific type of learning disability, which is frustrating when you're a parent because you want to narrow down exactly what's going on with your kid. So I would start with the basic cognitive testing, which is the psychoeducational testing, the intelligence, and the academic. Look at some behavior scales. But then if you feel like there's something else that's really going on, that neuropsych evaluation is always something you can pull out of your pocket and say, there's something else going on here, and I want to narrow it down and get more specific. So schools cannot diagnose a student with any kind of disability, but through that testing through the school, you can kind of narrow down what's going on with the kiddo. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, there are, specific evaluations that are geared towards reading. My experience has been that the majority of evaluations done like within a school district, again, they'll be able to point out that there's a deficit, not necessarily what is causing that deficit. So you might have someone who does poorly in reading, and then you ask for, specific reading evaluations, and that the results will come back and say, yep, just as we suspected, they can't read. But there's never like that why component that's sort of looked at, which is why I love neuropsychs more than anything else. Sorry, not sorry.
Thank you. Yeah, it's tricky, right? That's, and of course parents, you're trying to figure out like what is actually going on here, and it can take a long time, and that's a long process. And to that end, there's a question about what can family and youth care advocates do? Like, what do you recommend family and youth care advocates do to support parents, specifically as it relates to obtaining and understanding and advocating based on the results of evaluations?
So having been in this role for a number of years as a family peer advocate, the first thing I would say is now that you have at least a working understanding of what those different tests assess and how to read those scores, help your families do the same thing. Again, you don't have to be an expert, but take that information, help them put it on a visual format, put it on a bell curve form, and explain to them, this is why we're looking at this test, and we're looking for discrepancies, and does this make sense to you? And then help them come up with the questions that they want to ask at the CSE meeting. Why is his working memory score so low compared to everything else? Why is everything in the normal or the average range? There's no such thing as normal. Why is everything in the average range, but he's failing all of his classes? Come up with the questions. I'm sorry, Mindy. It's really, that's your role as the family peer advocate, is to help families navigate that process and understand what that information is and come up with those right questions. Go ahead, Mindy.
I also encourage parents at CSE meetings to ask exactly, how does this impact on my child in social studies? How does this impact on my child in math? So be specific as to exactly where and how the weaknesses are impacting in their daily classroom. And you know, you get to sit down with the people who have done the evaluations prior to the CSE meetings. They have to make sure that you understand exactly what those evaluations show and how they impact on their abilities to be successful in school.
I would also say I think it's hugely, hugely important for both parents and the students to understand that nothing found in an evaluation means you're stupid. Nothing means you are less than. Just reinforce the idea that everyone's brain is different and everyone learns skills or, you know, anything differently. And, you know, having a deficit in one area is not a reflection of your intelligence per se. It just means you need to be taught that information in a different way in order to learn the way, you know, you're supposed to be learning. I think a lot of parents and kids themselves have a difficult time with like the special education label. And, you know, I will joke with students and say, well, you didn't get your tattoo yet? You're going to get branded across your head like special education student, because they're so afraid of the stigma. Obviously, they're not branding anybody, but, you know, it means something bad to them. They'll say, I don't want to be in special ed. That means I'm stupid. It doesn't. It just means you're you and you're an individual, and we all do things differently in our own speed and our own way, and it needs to be recognized and acknowledged. And support them.
Thank you. A couple of speed questions. First of all, can an assistive technology evaluation be requested and supports provided for non-core subjects? So if a student's having difficulty participating in music or art, PE.
Yep. If it's
Okay.
a part of a student's academic day, it can be part of an assistive technology evaluation. Absolutely.
Excellent. And another, I think, relatively simple question. Well, maybe it's not so simple, but how long is a neuropsych evaluation valid for?
So most evaluations, it's usually a 12-month period of time. They'll consider it to be valid and reliable.
Okay. And I guess, of course, you can always, you know, request another one, although doing them too soon may not actually yield, you know, different results. So someone else asking a question about independent evaluations, and just roughly based on your experience, all of you, how often are these requested, and how often do they jive or differ from the school district results? I think, you know, the person is just trying to gauge, you know, whether it's something that people should consider, or does it often yield the same results?
So independent educational evaluations, they're not something that's done very often in my experience, but I'm in a more rural area of New York State, so we don't do them very often. But they do come in handy when something from the original evaluation from the school just doesn't feel right. And you have to, when you're making that request for an independent educational evaluation, be able to say, I disagree with this from the original evaluation in order to request an independent educational evaluation at public expense. So they're not done very often, but the reason behind them is that there's something that's just not right from the original evaluation. So what you're looking for is to find out, does this truly give an accurate picture of what's going on with this child? And if it is, then that's great, because now you've confirmed that everything that was from the original evaluation is accurate. If it doesn't, maybe that means that there's something else going on, and maybe the original testing was done on a bad day. Maybe there's some other things going on with the child's brain and how well they process information. I think the independent educational evaluation can actually give you a lot more information than just, you know, reassessing in that particular area.
I would say, well, we tend to use the IEEs as sort of a backdoor for evaluations that districts are refusing to agree to at CSE. It comes in most often with the neuropsych. So when parents, you know, disagree with psychoed testing, it's not so much that they're saying they disagree with what they're seeing in that psychoed evaluation. They're disagreeing with what the school district's takeaway is, because they'll say, you know, everything's fine, there's not a problem here. and, you know, repeating psychoed testing, chances are those scores will look the same, and that's not really the information the parent's looking for. So they will request a neuropsych, and when the school says, no way, like, we're not doing a neuropsych, we've had a lot of success having parents write letters requesting the neuropsych as an independent because they've asked for it already. The school district has said, no, it's not necessary. And the parents say, it's an area of suspected disability. It's my right to request it. And once they put it in writing for an IEE, the school either has to do it or they have to take them to an impartial hearing, and the cost of the neuropsych way less than the cost of a hearing.
Thank you. So I'm sorry to thank you, Jen, and also Rosalia and Mindy and Mona, who's not here anymore. Sorry to sort of abruptly end this, but these are all really important conversations, and we expect to continue to do some more work together to support your work, to support kids and their families. So, you know, I'm going to ask Jen to just flip through the next couple slides really quickly. You're also going to see a link coming up in the chat where you can fill out our CTAC evaluation. These are the links to the recordings of the previous 2 webinars. Next slide, please. And then these are some upcoming webinars that you might be interested in that are coming up soon that CTAC is hosting. And our next slide will just give you the contact information for our 2 wonderful presenters today. And if you live on Long Island or if you live in one of the 10 counties in northern New York, these are great resources for you. And if you're joining us from somewhere else and you would like a local contact, let us know at CTAC. That's the next slide. And we'll connect you to some folks that can get you support. And with that, I want to thank our presenters and all of you for attending, and we hope everyone has a lovely afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.